trait if they were German. And they then calculated what's known as the diagnostic ratio, which is the ratio of the probability of having the trait if you're German, divided by the probability of having the trait in general. And what they discovered was that the traits that formed the German stereotype all had a positive ratio. That is to say, people believed that if you were German, you were more likely to have a particular trait than if you were a person, if you were just a person in the general population. This is apparently what stereotype beliefs come from, what stereotype beliefs mean. Not that everybody in a group has the trait. Not even that the majority of people in the group have a trait. It could be that the minority of people in a group have a trait, but as long as the belief is that more people in a particular group have the trait compared to the population at large, that trait will become part of the stereotype. So again, in terms of the question of how do traits become part of a stereotype, Macaulay and Stitt, using this kind of probabilistic analysis, appear to have given us the answer. That people do something like calculating probabilities, and they try to figure out whether the probability of people in some group displaying, an individual from some group displaying a trait as opposed to people at large, and if that diagnostic ratio is above 1, that is high, okay, then that trait will go into the stereotype. So that's what the stereotype has. It has typical traits where typicality is defined in these strictly probabilistic terms. Okay, so there you go. Stereotype traits need not be present in all group members. Nobody believes that. They don't even need to be present in the majority of group members. But what the stereotype traits are believed, and I want to emphasize believed, to be relatively more probable in group members compared to another group, like the in-group, or compared to the population as a whole. But again, I want to emphasize this belief. Nobody knows really what the likelihood of somebody is being, what the likelihood is that somebody is industrious. Far fewer people know what the likelihood is that some German is, or that the Germans are industrious. These are subjective probabilities. These are beliefs that are acquired through socialization, but they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily correspond to reality. Okay, so where do these stereotypes come from? Where do these beliefs come from? Well, one way to think about this is that they're a product of socialization and social learning. The old Rodgers and Hammerstein song, "You've got to be carefully taught who to hate and fear," is part of this. It's been suggested that stereotypes often reflect a kind of direct experience that people have with out-group members. That's the source of this idea that stereotypes contain a kernel of truth. A couple of problems with that, one of which is that very often in-group members who stereotype out-group members haven't had that much contact with out-group members. And this goes back to the original Katz and Braley study. These Princeton students, coming from a very, very homogeneous social background, had very likely not had any substantive contact with a lot of the people about whom they were checking off personality traits. So there are problems with this direct experience idea. One is that people's experience with stereotype out-groups is likely to be relatively limited, and the other is that for the most part, stereotypes are really not true representations of what these people are like. So you've got to have some other idea about the sources of stereotypes other than this kind of kernel of truth that gets magnified somehow. Okay. One prominent theory about the sources of stereotyping makes use of a cognitive phenomenon known as the illusory correlation. And what the illusory correlation, well, the illusory correlation comes in two basic forms. One is where we can create a correlation in our heads where none exists at all. The other form of the illusory correlation is that by virtue of the illusory correlation, we magnify a correlation that actually exists in nature, so that in reality, so that we believe the correlation is bigger than it is. One way in which this illusory correlation happens is precisely by virtue of the fact that we possess these stereotype beliefs about other people, so that they form the basis for perceptual confirmation processes. If we believe that members of some group are typically aggressive, and we observe ambiguous behavior on the part of some group member, we're now likely to interpret that ambiguous behavior as aggressive, because we're interpreting it in line with our stereotype beliefs. But there's another very interesting source of this, which is, has its origins in actually classical conditioning, the studies of classical conditioning, and that is what's known as the feature positive effect. It is a phenomenon of attention that people, and not just people, dogs, cats, rats, and pigeons too, but people especially, pay attention to the conjunction of unusual features. If something very unusual, if something very salient happens in the environment, and something else happens in the environment that's also unusual and salient, we have a tendency to put these together. This is known as the feature positive effect, because what we pay attention to is the presence of features, not their absence. Okay? Here's an example of the feature positive. Oh, I didn't want to do this yet. Well, okay. No, I'm going to do this. Here we go. This is a study again by Dave Hamilton at UC Santa Barbara and his colleagues. They constructed artificial groups, Group A and Group B, and listed for their subjects a set of behaviors that were displayed by members of each of these groups. 27 of the behaviors were moderately socially desirable, like is rarely late for work, that's a good thing. And 12 of these behaviors were moderately undesirable. He always talks about himself, which is typically a bad thing. And what they did was to present a number of these ascribe a number of these behaviors to members of one or the other two groups with a 9-to-4 ratio. So for Group A, they possessed 18 desirable behaviors. They displayed 18 desirable behaviors and 8 undesirable behaviors. For Group B, they displayed 9 desirable behaviors and 4 undesirable behaviors. So the ratio of desirable to undesirable behaviors was a constant 9-to-4 for both of the groups. But now, what happens when people are asked whether group members are desirable or not, what you see here is that when the actions are negative, you get this great magnification of the attribution of undesirability. So, for example, when the subjects are trying to attribute various kinds of traits, they're paying more attention to positive traits when those positive traits were in the minority. When they're in the majority, they're paying more attention to the negative traits when the negative traits are in the majority. This is an example of the feature positive effect. People are paying more attention to the things that are more salient in the environment. They're picking up on that. So, for example, if there's some group out there that's an unusual group, a minority group in the population, and that group engages in some unusual salient behavior, there's going to be an attachment between the behavior and the unusual group. That's how the feature positive effect works. Okay, now I'm going to go back here. I got these out of order somehow. Talk about how the stereotypes are generally thought to be untrue, but how really would we know? How do we know how various groups stand on various characteristics? Chick Judd and Denise Park at the University of Colorado had the opportunity to do this kind of study, not with respect to racial stereotyping or gender stereotyping or ethnic stereotyping, but rather with political stereotyping, making use of results from an election study that was conducted in 1976. Here, representative population samples of Democratic and Republican voters were surveyed, and they were asked to rate their own positions on 10 hot-button political issues of the time. Whether people accused of a crime had too many rights, whether minorities were getting too much aid, whether school busing was a good or bad thing, whether there should be government health insurance plan. This is 1976, and they were talking about government health insurance. Okay. In this survey, the subjects, Democratic and Republican voters, were asked to state their own position. These statements of their own position then became the criterion against which people's political stereotypes could be assessed, because these subjects were also asked to indicate what position would be taken on each of these 10 issues by Democrats in general, Democrats being the in-group of the Democratic voters, the out-group for the Republican voters, and they were also asked what position would be taken on each of these issues by Republicans in general. Again, Republicans being the out-group for the Democratic voters and the in-group for the Republican voters. Here are the results of that study. What we got here is a score, discrepancy score, that basically represents the difference between people's beliefs about these political parties and what the actual standing of political party members were on these 10 issues. This is in the liberal, large discrepancies here, small discrepancies here. Now, what you've got are Democratic subjects on the left, Republican subjects on the right, and Democratic targets in green and Republican targets in blue. And the general finding here was that both Democrats and Republicans overestimated the liberalness of various kinds of people. That's what this discrepancy score essentially means here. But what you notice is that Democrats were more accurate in their perception of other Democrats than they were in their perception of Republicans. Republicans also overestimated the liberality of other Republicans, that is, saw other Republicans as more liberal than they actually were. This is one of the few studies in the literature where we actually have something like an objective criterion against which we can assess people's stereotypes. We don't have anything like this with typically with gender stereotypes or with racial stereotypes or other kinds of ethnic stereotypes. But this is a way in which this was kind of one chance in a million in which we could actually look at these particular kinds of stereotypes and assess the extent to which they were accurate or not. So, in fact, Democrats were less liberal than they were perceived to be, and Republicans were actually more liberal than they were perceived to be. This was in 1976. Again, if you did this study again today, you might not get the same kinds of results. Here is another version of this. What we've got here is the sensitivity of people's political judgments, essentially the correlation between people's beliefs about Democrats and Republicans and where Democrats and Republicans actually stood. And here, what you see is that this correlation is higher when Democrats are rating Democrats than when they're rating Republicans, and the correlation is higher when Republicans are rating Republicans than when Republicans are rating Democrats. So again, you've got a way of assessing the accuracy of these various kinds of stereotypes. Okay, this is the kind of thing you'd love to be able to do with other kinds of studies, because a stereotype is a perception, right? And what you want, if you want adaptive behavior, you want your perception of the world to be relatively congruent with the way the world really is. Okay, but if this is any example, in fact, there's quite a bit of variance between what people believe about various kinds of groups and the way those groups actually do believe. Okay, now let's go to this. Gotta go right here. Okay. Typically, we think about prejudice and stereotyping as something that people do consciously. You're walking down the street, you see some member of an ethnic minority group or whatever, and all of a sudden, this negative stereotype is automatically activated. But if you'll remember the Patricia Devine's theory about stereotyping, we can control the effects of these stereotypes on our behavior when we recognize that the stereotype is not congruent with our own personal beliefs. In other words, by virtue of being aware of our stereotypes and prejudices, we can consciously control them. That's been the general the way of thinking about stereotyping all these years, ever since Katz and Braley, and for that matter, Lippmann. More recently, Mazur and Banaji and Tony Greenwald have suggested that in addition to our conscious biases and stereotypes, we also carry around in our heads unconscious biases and stereotypes, what they call blind spot, the hidden biases we all carry from a lifetime exposure to various cultural attitudes that influence our perceptions of social groups without our awareness or our conscious control, and that these unconscious prejudices shape our likes and dislikes and behavior towards other people. Banaji and Greenwald have proposed that people's unconscious, implicit prejudices can be assessed through a technique that they call the implicit attitude test. I don't have time to go through all the vagaries of the implicit attitude test here. There's a very thorough discussion of it in the lecture supplements for those of you who are interested. The point I only want to make here is that Banaji and Greenwald have presented the implicit attitude test not just to the scholarly community, but to people at large as an assessment of people's unconscious attitudes, stereotypes, and prejudices. A test that will reveal what people really think unconsciously, which may be very different from what they think consciously. So, for example, here we have differential performance on this implicit attitude test that reveals unconscious racial stereotyping on the part of white subjects. And in this particular study, we have, again, Japanese and Koreans, the subjects completing this test, revealing unconscious prejudice against Japanese on the part of Koreans and unconscious prejudice against Koreans on the part of Japanese. Here we go. If you simply ask people, how do you feel about black people? How do you feel about Japanese? How do you feel about Koreans? You get a measure of people's conscious attitudes. The general finding of studies with the implicit attitudes test is that the correlation between people's conscious attitudes as revealed by standard attitude checklist and people's unconscious attitudes as revealed by tests like the implicit attitudes test, that correlation is relatively low. which Banaji and Greenwald take as evidence that people really do have these unconscious attitudes, and that these unconscious attitudes that influence people's behavior. Maybe, but I'd urge, just in the couple minutes we have left together, a series of just some caution about interpreting the implicit attitudes test. Okay, the first is that, in fact, although those correlations between conscious and unconscious, explicit and implicit attitudes look relatively low, they're far from a perfect 1.0. By the standards of social science research, they are actually pretty high. Okay, so in fact, it's not clear that people's unconscious attitudes are all that discrepant from their conscious attitudes. The second point is that the implicit attitudes test does not clearly distinguish between people's knowledge of social stereotypes and their personal beliefs. Okay, a distinction that, according to Devine and Elliott, should be fundamental to any discussion of stereotyping. It's entirely possible that what looks like prejudice on the implicit attitudes test simply reflects a person's knowledge about social stereotypes and does not necessarily represent what he or she believes. The problem with the implicit attitudes test is the problem of what William James called the psychologist's fallacy, which is the inappropriate belief that the psychologist's explanation of behavior is the correct explanation of behavior. Here, I think Banaji and Greenwald have actually made a mistake, very much like the psychologist's fallacy. They're willing to attribute to people beliefs, unconscious beliefs, that may or may not be true because they fail to distinguish between people's abstract knowledge of a social stereotype on one hand and people's actual personal beliefs on the other. So when you confront the implicit attitudes test, and you will see references to this around quite a bit, keep in mind that this fundamental distinction between knowledge and belief, between cultural expectation and personal belief, is not firmly made clear in the implicit attitudes test. Okay, that's enough for this. What we're going to do next week is to pick up some questions about social judgment, especially questions having to do with causal attribution, how we explain the causes of various kinds of behaviors. Thank you very much.